want to thank everybody for joining us. Reasonable Faith International Directors Book Study. Right now, as an organization, we are working through Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology. And we have had the pleasure of working through the book with the men and women and the authors that wrote the book. And this week, we are talking about Chapter 2, which is the cosmological argument. And that was written by Professor Alexander Pruss, who is joining us on the call today. Professor Pruss is a professor at Baylor University. His education is he holds 2 PhDs, 1 PhD in philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh, and 1 PhD in mathematics from the University of British Columbia. The professor has participated, written several books and peer-reviewed articles, books such as Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, One Body, an essay in Christian sexual ethics, and most notably and most relevant to today's conversation, he wrote a book called The Principle of Sufficient Reason, a Reassessment. So today we are going to be discussing cosmology, PSR, and the professor is going to be helping us with that. So without further ado, Professor Pruss, I want to give you the liberty to share any opening thoughts, and then from there we will follow up with some thoughts and questions, sir.
Yeah, so I guess arguments for the existence of God, I see them as kind of divided into two sorts. There is ones that are based on some sort of observation about the world, and one's just based on logic alone. The ones based on logic alone are the ontological ones. The ones based on observation of the world, they divide up depending, one way to divide them up is to see how specific that observation is. Some arguments involve very specific observations, like claims about miracles, which are very, very specific. Some arguments involve less specific observations, like that there is complex life, and we've got the design arguments are like that. And then the cosmological arguments are ones that involve just this tiniest little bit of observation about the world, like that there's something, or that there's contingency, or that there's causation, or that there's change. So something highly general, highly uncontroversial is the starting point. But of course, then we go from that highly uncontroversial starting point to a controversial conclusion when we ask for the explanation of that feature. And the argument from contingency says, okay, some things are contingent. Contingent things are things that don't have to be the way they are. They don't have to exist. So you and I are contingent beings. There's all sorts of stuff that our existence depends on, and if those things didn't take place, we wouldn't be here. On the other hand, there are at least some necessary truths, like that 2 + 2 = 4, or that contradictions are impossible. And the basic idea is just, well, everything's got an explanation. We need an explanation for all of the contingent things in the world. That explanation cannot itself be one of the contingent things, because that would be viciously circular. So that explanation has to involve something that isn't contingent, something that is necessary, something that has to exist. And that's sort of the first half of the argument, and that's what most of my work has focused on, is that first half. And then the second half is trying to argue that this necessary being, that our best account of what this necessary being is that it's a being that's all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing, and hence God.
Wonderful. Professor, I think it goes without saying, you have been so monumental to the field with what you have brought forward. I so enjoy your talks. Your chapter in the book is rigorous, yet it is inviting in so many different ways, and so well-rounded. Today, I will audaciously invite you to help me as I I was telling this to Charles earlier. I believe I will present to you a potential argument for circular causality, and I will allow you to aid to see if I have any merit to what I will present to you. It is in 5 years I've never done anything like this, so I will ask for your grace in that. Before I get to that, I want to open the floor to the other directors on the call. Does anybody have any initial thoughts or responses or questions for Professor Pruss? Go ahead, Chris.
I maybe should have asked this before we recorded in case it's too ignorant of a question, but all the work that I saw you did, do you ever find it unfortunate we're having to argue for a principle sufficient reason, much like having to argue against those who think the world's flat or who propose some other silly argument? You've done such a thorough work to argue something that should seem to be obvious. The fact that Hume would propose that we can have an infinite regress and it makes sense. Does it bother you at all that you have to work so hard to argue something that's so obvious?
Yeah, I mean, it is strange, right? I mean, when I talk to students about various arguments, they seem that's a premise they seem very happy to accept. I think it's deeply built into our practices as investigators, including our scientific practices. I think it's probably true that a large part of the reason the principle of sufficient reason gets denied is because it so very naturally leads to the existence of God. That's not the only reason. There are some actual positive arguments against it, but that I think is a significant part of it. I was once I was reading a paper in Faith and Philosophy, and my copy of the paper had the last page of the previous paper, and I have no idea what that paper was on, but I remember one footnote in that paper. It said, I had a high school math teacher who said that if it were shown to me that from 2 + 2 = 4, you could conclude that God exists, I would deny that 2 + 2 = 4.
Thank you for
I
that.
don't know whose math teacher that was or how, but there is that sort of personality. And I don't think that's the only thing that's going against the principle of sufficient reason, but I think that that's certainly a part of it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Great question. Thank you for that question, Chris. Did anyone else want to weigh in some initial thoughts for the professor at this point?
Yeah, John, if I may.
Go ahead, Jacob.
Dr. Pruss, such a privilege to be here with you and with the chapter directors. So I'm asking this question more of when dealing with the public audience, because that's where most of my apologetics engagement lies.
Yeah.
So when we are to explain to a common layman the difference between identifying something as contingent and something as necessary, how do we make it evident without going into so much of philosophy? And I'm talking to a lay person, and most of the times I interact with my Indian audience, so therefore I would be speaking and conveying the point in the local language. So I have a huge language barrier. So what is one way that you would use to make the distinction between contingent and necessary entities real for a lay person?
I think the same thing as for a philosopher, namely by example. I think that's the idea, is that we have some things are the way they are because they have to be the way they are. There's no possibility for 2 + 2 to be equal to anything other than 4. There doesn't have to be anything that makes it be 4. it just is that way and has to be that way. Anything else is in some way a contradiction, or if maybe not exactly a contradiction, in some other way just an impossibility. And so we can give examples of things that are necessary. It's necessary that 2 + 2 = 4. It's necessary that a molecule of water, that if there is any molecules of water, they contain 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. It is necessary that nothing is its own cause. These are things that, if you deny them, you end up in something, if not exactly a logical contradiction, because it's not just logic that shows you that water is H2O, it's something else beyond logic, but it ends up in some sense, a contradiction, some sort of impossibility. And then there's things that are true, but but we want to say they didn't have to be this way. So, for example, on Earth, the intelligent animals have 2 legs. Things could have evolved differently. Could have been 4-legged critters could have been intelligent instead, or aquatic creatures that have no legs could have been intelligent instead. That's contingent. It's contingent that the laws of nature are as they are. It would be just really strange to think that, for example, the fine structure constant, which is 1/137.00, I think 4, had to be that way. No, it didn't have to be that. It could have been some other number. So there's some things that are, that's my approach. And you might, depending on the audience, you choose the examples differently. But the idea is you point to this idea that there are things that are necessary, things that are contingent. Maybe sometimes you want to go on the opposite side of the necessary and talk about things that are impossible, which is kind of the flip side, right? Something is impossible provided that it's necessarily not true. And something is conversely possible provided that it's not necessarily false. So sometimes you go through that, but that's what I do with my students with my undergraduates when I introduce them, is I just go through a lot of examples.
All right. Thank you, Doctor.
Because I don't think there's a definition, like fundamental concepts, I don't think can be defined. And I think what we do is we get them by example.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I think we also saw that in the life of Jesus, using many, many examples, and some of the most famous teachers use many, many examples in order to get those ideas across. So that's, especially for a topic as rigorous as yours, Professor, that is very great advice. Go ahead, Chris.
So reading through your work, I found that obviously your arguments were compelling, but it seems to me, as with my first question, the problem starts with the opponent's unwillingness to accept the PSR. And then because they're unwilling to accept that, they have to give some sort of argument as to why it's incorrect. Not focus on the analytic philosophy, where do you think that stems from? Do you think that the opponents of the PSR are primarily arguing in order to avoid having to follow the logical path to God? Or like we look at the noetic effects of sin, or what is their impetus for arguing against what seems to be so obvious?
I think there are 2. One is that it leads to, that it so very naturally leads to a necessary being. The second is human intuition. So, and the first one is going to be a lot of non-philosophers will be like that. The second one is going to be philosophers. And so for contemporary philosophers, a lot of them have this picture of the world that things are as, that causation doesn't really, it's just some sort of order of things and one thing following after another. And then it's if you think of causation as just, sort of regular order of things, so that each time you strike a match, it catches on fire and there's no like special connection between them, then it starts to sound pretty strange when you start saying everything has to have a cause. Like, why, I mean, given the causation itself is like this cosmic coincidence between events, as Hume teaches, then it's really strange to think that you always have to have a cause for contingent things. So I think a kind of Humean metaphysics of causation and is probably the main explanation among philosophers. I don't know that, outside of those philosophers who are strongly committed to Humeanism or who really want to argue against the existence of God, I don't know that people are that opposed, like in the strong sense of thinking the principle is false. I think there may be more of a sort of agnosticism, like, yes, we know that in the past people like Leibniz thought this was true, but we're not sure anymore. So I think for a lot of it, it'll be more of a skepticism, I think, than an outright denial. And then for some philosophers, there will be like a specific argument, and specifically the one that Van Inwagen did such a good job of describing that I discuss in the paper at length. I think that's, so I guess three things, right? There is, in terms of the people who deny the principle of sufficient reason, sorry, I'm sort of got myself a bit lost. Three things. One, atheism. Two, Hume. And three, these kinds of arguments like Van Inwagen gave. Maybe, let's see, no, I keep on thinking of more things. I guess there's also, some people have worries about free will. The idea, can free actions be possibly explained? I think they can, but some people have worries about that. And I think there will be some Christians in this camp who think that free actions cannot be explained and who therefore will want to at least make exceptions for in the principle of sufficient reason that allow for free action. I don't think one needs to make an exception. I think free action doesn't violate the principle that everything has an explanation. And then some people think quantum mechanics is something else that where explanations cannot be given. And again, I think about quantum mechanics, what I think about free will, that you actually do have explanations there.
I would agree. See, it would seem quantum mechanics, much like the multiverse, is the layman's. They're unknowingly just stepping one down. Because quantum mechanics, you still have to have matter to have an effect, and that matter has to come from something. And so we return to the principle of sufficient reason. Where did that come from? Even if there's a vacuum being filled.
Right, and even if you've got so quantum mechanics, as on the usual interpretation, will tell us that there are some events that are due to chance, but those are not. And so some people want to say those things have no explanation, but they're not just due to chance, right? So what we have is we have an experimental setup, say an electron sent through a magnetic field, and it behaves in an unpredictable way. But we still have a cause. There's an electron there. It's been sent through in a magnetic field. There is a cause. It's just not the sort of cause that determines one possible outcome. There's multiple outcomes are possible from that setup, but still you have a cause.
Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I saw Ian's hand go up. If you guys...
And Omar's got a virtual hand.
Oh, Omar's got a virtual hand. Okay, great. So we'll start with Omar and then go to Ian. If you guys want to maybe throw in the chat next time you guys have a question, that may help as well. Go ahead, Omar.
Okay. It's an honor to meet Dr. Pruss. So my question is about the regress problem. Since you briefly mentioned it, you said that if we have an infinite regress of explanations, then everything in the regress would be explained without
I'm working on it.
Explanation. So my question is would you expound how Hume argued for it his position?
Yeah, so I think we've got two things in Hume. One, he has an argument that an infinite regress can provide a genuine explanation. And secondly, as a backup, in case that doesn't work, he's not committed to there being explanations anyway. So if it turns out that an infinite regress doesn't explain things, he denies the principle of sufficient reason and is happy to say some things just don't have an explanation. So we talked a little bit about the other one. That's the stuff about the principle of sufficient reason. Let me talk about the first one, the regress. So Hume thinks that in a regress, each item is explained by the one before it. And so he says, okay, well, if each one is explained by the one before it, the whole regress is explained. And that has always struck me as very fishy, right? So back in the day, one of the big scientific and philosophical problems back in the day when we thought the Earth was flat was why the Earth doesn't fall down, right? So look, everything goes down, everything heavy goes down, right? So some things go up, like smoke goes up because it's really light, but all the heavy stuff goes down. But the Earth is heavy, right? The Earth is very heavy, so it ought to go down because it's rocky and so on. So why isn't the Earth falling? Well, to that end, various theories people came up with, and one of them was, well, the Earth, something is holding the Earth up. There are pillars that are holding up the Earth. And it's funny, though, because, of course, this is a silly answer, because then you wonder what holds up the pillars. I mean, you just had this heavy Earth, and under it, you put another heavy thing. Now it seems like it should be even harder for it to stay up, right? There's even more stuff that has to be held up. So what do you say? Maybe there are more pillars under the pillars and so on. But even if you have infinitely many things holding it up, like maybe infinitely many turtles, one under the other or something, you haven't come any closer to explaining why this whole pillar or this whole chain of things is being held up. And if you've just added to it and then made it even more puzzling, right? It's puzzling why the Earth doesn't fall. The Earth plus the pillars has even more stuff that's puzzling as to why it doesn't fall. And the Earth plus the pillars plus whatever those pillars are on, that's even harder. So I think the regress just increases the amount of stuff that is not explained. And so it makes the problem more difficult, if anything. So I think that's my main answer. Let's see, what else do I want to say about that? I have somewhere this interesting little argument saying that, and this will relate to the thing that, to the things about circular causation, but it's a sort of nice little thing. So I can't remember if I talked about it in this paper, but if you think that you could have an infinite regress, then you could imagine an infinite regress, and then label every second item in the regress a chicken and every second item an egg, right? So the odd numbered ones are maybe eggs and the even numbered ones are chickens. Okay, so we've got the present state. It's caused by some chicken. There's an egg before it. Before that, there's a chicken. It sounds like, okay, that's an infinite regress, but it's also a circularity, because if you look at the chickens as a whole, that whole sequence of chickens comes from the eggs, and the whole sequence of eggs comes from a sequence of chickens. So an infinite regress is kind of like circularity. If you just number the odd ones, you split up into the odd ones and the even ones cause the odd ones and the other way around. And that seems absurd. Now, of course, we will talk about later about whether circular causation is absurd. So that's another move I try to make, is to say that infinite regresses are not very different from circularity.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, I want to take a moment and just say thank you, Professor. I mean, I know these things are never, you never know what to expect with these things. And here at Reasonable Faith, as you know, we spend every single day in the community, in universities and schools, all around the world. There's at least 15 different time zones on this call right now, for the name of Christ, to keep Christianity a reasonable option for thinking men and women. And so, having you here to aid us with that, I just can't reiterate enough how important that is. Okay.
And I can't reiterate how important your work is. It's God's own work, and I am really grateful you're doing it. You guys are way better than me at conveying these things to the general public, and I'm really grateful that you're living out this calling, and I pray that the Lord will help you with this in all your extremely important work.
That's an honor to hear that from you. I know it's encouraging for me. I hope it is for everyone else on the call. Ian, I think you were next in line, if I'm not mistaken. And then after you, Ian, I think I'm going to try to jump in here. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, can you hear me? Is my mic on?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us, Professor Pruss. It's just a fantastic. I was reading the chapter, and parts of my brain exploded. So I think you mentioned Graham Oppy having an objection. I know Dr. Craig has talked about Graham Oppy as being one of his most formidable atheist challenges. I wonder if you've got anything on Oppy's objections to the PSR. Whether you think he does make a good case.
I don't remember the objection in question. Can you remind me?
He was talking about forming the BCCF, I think, and whether it was possible to do that.
Yeah, so that's not an objection to the principle of sufficient reason. I think that's there is a serious technical issue here. These kinds of infinite conjunctions are kind of problematic. In practice, I don't think it's so, I could talk about the technicalities there, but in practice, I don't think one needs to. I think, for example, all we need to do is look at a smaller proposition than the really big one, probably, and apply the principle of sufficient reason to that. So, for example, we can ask, why are there any contingent things? Okay, so maybe this big contingent conjunctive truth or fact is problematic because it's got so much stuff in it. But you can have the simple fact, there are contingent things. That simple fact needs to have an explanation if the principle of sufficient reason is true. That explanation cannot itself be a contingent fact on pain of circularity. So why are there any contingent, or at least cannot depend on a contingent being? So there we can do it. We can look at smaller, perhaps also infinite conjunctions, like the conjunction of all propositions reporting the existence of a contingent being. So maybe this is finite, maybe this is infinite, depends on how many contingent beings there turn out to be in reality and in history. But it doesn't have the kinds of technical set theoretic worries that Oppy and others have raised from the BCCF. So I guess my move would be just to avoid the technicalities if necessary, and then I can try to engage in them. But to be honest, over the years I've come to think, yeah, maybe there's something to those worries. I've gotten more suspicious about infinities myself over time. More friendly towards Kalam type arguments than I was when I wrote this paper. So
it seems to be the challenge that they have is saying, well, we can observe these things around us in small things, but scaling up to the size of the universe seems to be the
I see. So that's okay, so I misremember. Yeah, so there's more than one objection here. One kind of objection is this highly technical one. We cannot form this big contingent conjunctive fact. It's just too infinite and it contains too many things. It'll maybe even contains itself as a part of itself. And the other move that Graham Oppy has made is this move of saying, okay, I grant that in ordinary cases, we assume the principle of sufficient reason, and that we need to assume it because maybe without it, we end up in skepticism. Maybe without it, we cannot do science, or maybe we at least are not motivated in science. But maybe all we need is some limited principle that says, well, maybe every item, maybe every individual object, every individual contingent object has an explanation, but that doesn't mean there's an explanation of all of them taken together.
Mhm.
I think, or maybe every material object has an explanation. Or maybe every object that has a beginning has an explanation. You have tried all of these kinds of options. So the name of that game is, we don't like the principle of sufficient reason. We're going to suppose something a little bit weaker than that and think it will do the job that we want the principle of sufficient reason to do, but it won't lead us to God. Well, there is a line of argument that Rob Coons at University of Texas and I have been pursuing, which is to argue that all of these that each of these replacements for the principle of sufficient reason, each of these weaker principles does one of two things, or sometimes both. Sometimes it turns out to be strong enough to give you the existence of God. Sometimes it turns out not to be strong enough for the kinds of things we want it for. So let me give an illustration. Here's one that turns out to be strong enough to lead to the existence of God. Suppose we want to say that every fact that's smaller than this totality BCCF has an explanation. So all the smaller ones do. Okay, here's what I do. I take the BCCF and I subtract from it the existence of horses. So I have the smaller fact, which is all the contingent truths except the ones having to do with horses, okay? And now if the principle of sufficient reason applies to that, because it's smaller, it implies there's an explanation for all of that, for all the things other than horses. Well, that explanation has to be one of two kinds. Either it has to involve a necessary being, or it has to involve a contingent being. If it involves a contingent being, that contingent being has to be a horse, because otherwise it's already included and we've got a circularity. So that means that if you think that, you have to think a horse created the universe. And nobody thinks that. We know where horses come from. They come from an evolutionary process of some sort. So the horse hypothesis doesn't work. And plus you could then run it again with sheep if you thought horses did it. And so it has to, so you have to go for a necessary being anyway. So if you say you've got a principle of sufficient reason for all the facts other than the biggest fact, you still have to suppose a necessary being. If you think the other kind of move that people have made is to say something like every being that has a beginning has an explanation. And then you say the universe doesn't have a beginning. So you want to restrict it to things that have a beginning. I think that doesn't do the job that we want the principle of sufficient reason to do. And the reason it doesn't do it is a little bit tricksy, but it has to do with the fact that if you think that you don't need an explanation, you just need an explanation for individual things that came into existence, then you have to allow for the possibility of infinite regresses. But infinite regresses are just as bad as things coming into existence out of nothing for the following reason. You could imagine something that comes into existence now and is caused by a cause half a second ago. That thing half a second ago could have been caused by something else a quarter of a second before that, which could have been caused by something an eighth of a second before that, and slightly before that, and so on. And you would have an infinite regress, all of which fits within the last second. And if the principle of sufficient reason doesn't apply to infinite regresses at all, then it doesn't apply, then really for all we know, anything in the world could have just come about by these tiny little regress, tiny but infinite. And so then you have to say, how do I know that all my sense impressions, all the things I see about the world are not just like illusions that came about due to this little infinite regress? Once you start, you could say, well, that's unlikely. But things that have no cause, you cannot say that they are likely or unlikely. Because where would they get their probabilities from? It's if they have no cause at all, there's no explanation, then we cannot, I think, say that they are likely or unlikely. So we've been trying to pursue this line. We have a recent paper that we wrote where we're defending this kind of line of thought. Yeah, so again, the idea is either the principle we think is strong enough to, well, I guess there might be a third option, which is that it's like completely ad hoc. It's like just invented just to avoid the existence of God. And I think often it overlaps with that.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. As I teased before, Professor, I'm going to attempt to lay something before you. And mind you all, this is outside of my realm. I'm kind of the intersection between objective moral reasoning and critical race theory. So this will be something different. Okay, so imagine, if you would, for a moment, that a person is making a cake. We know that the definition of cause treated roughly is giving rise to an action, phenomenon, or condition. So if person X is making a cake, even though the agent, if we're speaking about just contingent agency and contingent objects and mechanisms for a moment, even though the agent is influencing the making of the cake, from a contingent standpoint, the mechanisms are actually causing the cake. And we know this because if we repeat the mechanisms with the same objects in the same order, we get the same cake, even if we replace the agent or something of that nature. So I began to ask myself a few questions, Professor. I began to ask, well, what if the mechanisms and the objects existed necessarily? What if the mechanisms existed in one possible world, but could influence other possible worlds because they were necessary? And then what if the mechanisms were conceptual, necessarily conceptual? So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'll allow you guys to look at this. I just asked for grace. This is not at all me saying I'm taking this to the academy tomorrow. This is just sharing a thought. So I'm going to share my screen here. It looks like you'll have to give me permission. I'll just read it to you then. And maybe if you give me permission, just let me know, and I can.
How do I
can share my screen
more? I'll make you. Here's what I'll do. I'll make you a co-host. Maybe that will do it.
I think that might do it.
Yeah, that will do it.
And then Chris, I see your hand is up. Were you going to try to aid us here, or did you have a follow-up question after this one?
A follow-up after yours, sir.
Okay. I can share now. So that seemed to have worked. Okay. So once again, this is not for the academy necessarily, but this is for today's dialogue, just to see if you can help me think through this. So my initial thought was that contingent agents influence objects via mechanisms in order to cause other contingent mechanisms, as I just described with people making cake when we're talking about contingent objects. I also believe that whether it's contingent or necessary objects, they can still be influenced via contingent or necessarily existing agents. And I'll give you an example of this in a moment, to cause other contingent mechanisms. Now, I don't believe that the last mechanism or object can be necessary, obviously, because it's being caused. But I think this also doesn't violate the PSR. And so this is just, bear with me if you would. Necessarily existing objects impose themselves on contingent objects across all possible worlds. And the objects I'm thinking of are obviously abstract mathematical objects, as Plato famously proposed. I was actually able to hear Professor Van Inwagen in New York defend that as well. And so I'm specifically thinking about mathematical objects. And with this premise, I want to just briefly take you to the moment of creation of our universe. And imagine that there was a moment before the singularity when there was nothing here, that even though, as many argue, necessarily existing objects such as math, if you hold to that, I know you're a mathematician, were in the mind of God, this realm didn't necessarily exist. This realm didn't exist, so there was nothing here. But in the moment when it did exist, the moment that it did, it had to be imposed upon by these necessarily existing, like there had to be so many particles, and there had to be so many of this and that. And so going back to the illustration of the cake, and I'll show you my conclusion there. Going back to the illustration of the cake, it's maybe a weaker treatment of the word cause. I chose to use the word align, and this has not been vetted. Once again, this is just for conversation's sake, just in case we needed something to beat up as a group. The concepts, if they did not exist necessarily in the mind of God, there would be no way intelligently, there would be no such thing as one in the new world that was created. And so even though God created one Adam or one man in the new world, the concept of one exists necessarily, and thus it was more that it had to be aligned with that concept. And so the necessarily existing concept of one that existed in the world before our universe essentially begat itself in the next universe in a way. And so I just want you to, like I said, this was just for discussion today. I open it up for you for critique and evaluation graciously. And I will stop sharing if that's okay, unless you want me to keep sharing while you respond.
Keep it up for a little bit, please. So where's the circularity?
So for me, it's when that last on the conclusion there, and like I said, it's kind of a weaker link, if you would. That's why I use the word align officially. But in premise 2, the necessarily existing object, more so in premise 3, the necessarily existing object in this example would be the mathematical. In my example, it's the mathematical entity 1 that exists necessarily in the mind of God. When God creates one man on earth in another possible world, in order for it to be one man, he must consistently align with the necessarily existing concept of one. And so one is almost like a mold. That's why I use the example of somebody making a cake. One is like the mold to create the concept of one in our possible world. And so the moment that the world exists, one must be aligned with, because it essentially comes into existence in this new world, even though it's necessary, and thus causes the concept of one man. And so in a weaker sense, it's as if without one existing in the mind of God, one couldn't exist in the new world, and thus, by definition, is essential in causing there to be a concept of one in the next world. And so there's kind of this necessary circular motion of one causing itself in every new possible world, because it's a necessary object. Without it, you could have creation, but you couldn't have the concept of one.
I see a hand up from Chris. I don't know, Chris, do you want to comment on that?
My comment had to do earlier with Zeno's paradox, but I will comment on this. So then, John, wouldn't they actually be, to use the word actually again, actualizing themselves in the real world and moving from concept either in God's mind or in a Platonic ether into an actuality? And that's a chain of that there is the causation in a linear fashion. I don't see them circularly causing themselves to have become a concept in their actualization. If that makes sense.
That's helpful. I think that that may be the thought. As I said, I kind of teed this up for, for us to have something to discuss in the case of there being
Sure.
a need for something like that. But I imagine that since the possible world didn't exist, yes, there's an actualization for the concept since it was in the mind of God. Once the possible world comes into existence, it would actualize, and that actualization would be, and help me here, Professor, would that then not be necessarily the causation, I'm not sure. I'll say I'm not sure. I wanted to present the thought, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting set of questions, and it relates to some really hard questions that I don't have good answers to. But it seems to me that you either want to say that the concept as it exists in the created world is the same or different from the one as it existed in the mind of God. Right? It's either the same or different. If it's the same as the one that exists in the mind of God, then it's not a case, I think, of it causing itself. It's just a case of it coming to be present in a new way, namely coming to be present in the world. It's almost like an incarnation, not of course in the same kind of deep theological, with the deep theological meaning, but there's a kind of like, yeah, so there's the oneness in the mind of God, and then this very same oneness is present in the world. That would be the one view. And I think there's no circular causation. There's just the oneness from the mind of God moving into oneness, the same oneness in the world. And what's caused, I guess, is that it comes to be present in the world. The other possibility is that it's actually a different thing, that there's like the concept in the mind of God, and then there's some kind of created oneness in the world. And if you have that view, then it seems to me like it's not circular either, because it's two different things. So there's the oneness in the mind of God that then causes this created oneness, which is a different kind of oneness. Now, I have to say, for me, what is most troubling about all this is or maybe not troubling, but puzzling as these, and I said I find these questions very difficult, is this question of what are these ideas in the mind of God? I don't want to say that they are in any way prior to God, because God is the very first thing. He is prior to everything. But at the same time, it does seem like God's got ideas, right? I believe in divine simplicity. I'm a classical theist. I don't think there's any division in God. But the divine ideas, what are they? This is really hard stuff. And I don't have anything really great to say on it, I think. But I think I don't have to say anything about that to answer this question. I think my answer to you, John, is just either this concept as it exists in the created world is a new thing, or it's not a new thing. If it's not a new thing, it's not caused. What's just caused is its new way of being, or its new way of being present. And if it is caused, then it is it's a new thing, and there's no circularity either. This I see is very much what Chris, I think, is. I'm just seeing him put in chat, and I think it's kind of what I heard him saying, is that I think he was taking this idea that because he says their actuation didn't cause the concept to exist. What happened, I guess, is that they became actualized, and being actualized is not, I guess, the same as coming to exist.
Well, Dr. Craig argues against any kind of necessary objects, doesn't he? Abstract objects. So everything would have to be created. And then in any case, an abstract object by definition is causally effete, so it can't cause anything. Isn't that the case?
I don't know, actually, because if abstract objects are ideas in the mind of God, then in some sense we could say they are, well, I believe divine simplicity, so then they are actually God. But in any case, they either are God, in which case they are causally efficacious, or else they influence God, because God creates in light of his wonderful ideas. And so there is some sort of influence. Maybe we don't want to say it's a causal influence, but there's some sort of influence there.
Doesn't seem to be any way that an abstract object could enter into a circular. I couldn't quite.
Yeah,
see.
I don't see it.
I mean, if anything else
I mean,
was necessarily.
I mean, usually when people bring up circular causation, it's with regard to something like Penrose's cosmic circular model, where it's all contingent things causing themselves via infinite circularity.
Yeah, I think that what you guys have helped me think through is, as you stated, it either has to be the same oneness in the mind of God or a different type of oneness, Professor. And as I think about it from the perspective of the new possible world, though it's an actualization, as Chris pointed out, it would appear that at the moment when the man was created, yes, the actualization had to take place instantaneously. I mean, there had to be an immediate imposition of the necessary idea of one in order for there to be an understanding of how many men had thus been created. And so I think that's where I was thinking, well, perhaps in that way, one has just caused itself. But I think you've helped me think through that, which is helpful. Jacob, I see your hand. Chris, did you guys want to weigh in before we begin to land the plane? And I can.
Do you want to? Yeah. Okay. Good. You close that.
Why don't you let Jacob weigh in first? I just want to make sure he gets a chance.
Yeah, the professor actually preemptively addressed the point of, because I was thinking when we talk about what the concepts that come into play here, I mean, God is not just thinking about mere numbers. There are other thoughts that we see also revealed in scripture. So I was thinking about how that would all come into play, but the professor actually addressed the ramifications that could follow of us, I think, going into mere speculation at that part. Yeah, so my question was addressed there. So over to you, Chris.
I'm sorry, the last couple of words dropped out and I didn't hear them.
Yeah, so I was saying that you actually pointed towards the ramification of trying to speculate what could be the different thoughts and ideas in God's mind. Obviously, they're going to be different from thinking about mere numbers. So I was thinking I was also thinking the same way that you think that could lead to ramifications to the point that we were discussing on, and you also address and echo that same notion. So my question was preemptively answered by you. So yeah, that's it.
Oh, okay.
So I'll go, if that's okay, John.
That's fine. That's good.
Okay. So I had my earlier question related to the application between our philosophical ideas, say like Zeno's paradox about crossing the stadium, and how we apply that. Yeah, I think you had said earlier that an infinite amount of time has spanned between the 1 second before something occurred, and the balance between, I hate to say reality, where we know we can only get down to, let's say, the measurement of light or Planck time in order to say that we can go no further back in a measurement of time. So at some point we are limited by, say, quarks or even the amount of matter in a vacuum. And so even though philosophically we can say there's an infinite regress, we're trapped by the limits of what we say are true measurements. The other thing I wanted to mention, and you can comment on either one, was how interesting it is, having read Francis Schaeffer, he had an interest in the apologetics of beauty. And for someone who delved so deep into modal logic, I've seen some of your work on arguments from beauty and how it's not common we see somebody span the two apologetic interests. So I was impressed with that by you, sir, and you can comment on either one you like.
Yeah, so I mean, I used this infinite regress as a response to a principle of sufficient reason that says that things that come into existence have to have a cause, but the universe did not come into existence, it was always there. I think my latest book was on paradoxes of infinity, and there I do argue that infinite causal regresses are just impossible. And if those arguments are correct, then yeah, no, you cannot have either one. But it also is then the case that this weaker principle of sufficient reason isn't any weaker after all, because it turns out the universe is one of those things that does have a beginning. So I think that line of, and you might have a line of thought that says that time itself is not infinitely subdivisible, like a lot of people used to think, but we come down to something like a Planck time and you can't divide it any further. Yeah, I guess that would affect that one argument I used if that turned out to be true. I think it would strengthen some of my arguments against infinite regresses in some other ways by making it sort of more clear that the universe is staying away from infinite regresses by not even having time be infinitely subdivided. It may not make a large contribution, but something there. The second thing was, what do I say about the aesthetic and this? Well, you know, there are sort of different arguments for the existence of God. And as I said at the beginning, the cosmological arguments start with this very, very little detail. Arguments from beauty start with a fair amount of detail. They start by saying, there are these wonderful things in the world, these beautiful things. And so it's a very different kind of argument because the starting points are different in that way. I think there's probably deep connections. I mean, there's a way in which the cosmological argument is an argument from being. And there's like this history of speculation since the Middle Ages that being and goodness and truth and beauty are all interchangeable in some deep way. From a theistic point of view, once we have the existence of God, that's very plausible because all of these things are ways of participating in God. And there's just one God. And so to be is to participate in God in some way. But God is also perfect beauty. And so it is to participate in beauty as well. And so I think at some deep level, there is beauty even behind these things in the cosmological argument. Personally, for me, yeah, I mean, beauty has always been an important part of my life. No, often the beauty of nature. I do think there's what Kant said, you know, about you see this beautiful world around you and you feel this need to give thanks for it. And we feel like this obligation to give thanks, but there can't be an obligation to give thanks unless there's someone to give thanks to, somebody who made it all. So I think there is much to that. I'm also often I go back and forth on exactly what to make of it, but I'm often very much struck by the beauty of mathematics, and I go back and forth on two stances to that. One is, well, maybe it's just the beauty that we find because we like the beautiful mathematics more, and so we focus more on the pretty parts of math rather than the ugly parts. But then I also think the other thought, which is, but mathematics is really, like Augustine said, about the ideas in the mind of God. And so we would expect it to be beautiful if God is beautiful, and at the same time, its beauty is a testimony to the beauty of God.
So I want to,
Thank you.
at this point, I want to honor the professor's time. I want to give a shout out. Mark Burris has got some fantastic questions and we may have to email those to the professor in honor of his
Yeah.
time.
I'm very happy to answer email questions.
Wonderful, wonderful. We always like to extend. Some guests like to go longer, but we never make that any type of a mandatory thing in honor of you so generously sharing time with us. So what we can do at this point is we can stop the recording and we can part ways. So before we end the recording, I just want to, on behalf of Reasonable Faith and all the different time zones and countries here, you guys can help me give a round of applause to the professor for just sharing some time with us today so graciously and last minute and being so flexible. So Professor, just know that we honor you, love you, and pray for you here at Reasonable Faith as we work alongside Bill Craig and all the various ministries to keep Christianity a viable option for thinking men and women in society.